Got some good stuff for you today, some good videos. Promise no bloody pictures or anything like that. So you have some good videos for you today. This should be a lot of fun. What is the population control agenda? Colonization of the mind. The Senegalese novelist Humudou Kane, I would recommend his writings very highly. Very articulate and astute man who talks about the corruption of the values of Africa, making its citizens think like North Americans or Europeans. That's the objective of the population control movement. Now, we can't go in there like we used to do with tanks and guns and bombs and aircraft and subdue a nation by force. So what we do is we make them think like Americans. We make them think like British. So they will willingly be subverted from the values of loving God and life into just loving things. And this has already advanced a far distance in Africa. The agenda is anything that will reduce the number of children, total fertility rate that women are having. This goes back as far as Bernard Berelson's recommendations for cutting the African population back in 1967. He recommended abortion, birth control, sterilization, divorce, sex education, even homosexuality. This was in Studies in Family Planning, April 1967, which is put out by the Population Council. The objective is worldwide sterility as much as possible. That's what they're going for. The motivations behind population control are the most interesting: greed, fear of famine in the USA and Europe, environmentalism, self-hatred, and racism. The first of these, the most prominent one, has always been greed. What is it all about? This document was promulgated under Richard Nixon back in 1974. Under Henry Kissinger's tutelage, his direction, it became known as the implications of population control and growth worldwide for U.S. economic interests. It's called National Security Study Memorandum 200, which was issued by the National Security Council, a top secret, very highly classified document that was declassified in 1989. And it says in here that the objective to hold down the population of other countries is not to improve their standard of living. We hear this constantly when we're in other countries. You have to have abortion in this country, you have to cut down your population so you can become a rich country. That's not what it's all about. This is a quote out of NSSM 200. The U.S. economy will require large and increasing amounts of minerals from abroad, especially from what they call LDCs, or less developed countries. This gives us enhanced interest in the political, economic, and social stability of the supplying countries. Wherever a lessening of population pressures through reduced birth rates can increase the prospects for such stability, population policy becomes relevant to resource supplies and the economic interests of the United States. So that's what it's all about. Continuing the flow of raw materials to the so-called developed world. If you look at how much we consume, the blue is developing countries, that's where most of the people live. The red is developed countries, Europe, South Africa, Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, North America, and the green is the United States. The developed world has only 22% of the world's population. The U.S. only has about 5%. But we consume 86% of the aluminum, 74% of the timber and wood, 69% of the energy, 62% of the meat, 46% of the fresh water, and generate 3/4 of the world's waste. This is all 22%, 1 out of 5 of the world's population. So the only way we're going to be able to keep this situation going is by stopping the development of these developing countries, by holding down their population, so we can continue to pillage their natural resources. We used to have an Office of Population in the United States government. Back in 1977, its director said, population control is needed to maintain the operation of our commercial interests around the world. Without our trying to help these countries with their economic and social development, the world would rebel against a strong U.S. commercial presence. The self-interest thing is a compelling element. Many times the environmental groups like the EDF let their guard down and tell us what they're really thinking. The only hope for the world is to make sure there's not another United States. We cannot let other countries have the same number of cars, the amount of industrialization we have in the U.S. We have to stop these third world countries right where they are, to leave them in poverty. Now the people in the third world, so-called third world in Asia, Latin America, and Africa, they know that population equals power. They know that the more people you have, the more powerful you're apt to be. And the idea behind all of this is to flood them with birth control, sterilization, and abortion, so they don't have as many children anymore. The great contradiction: how can we raise the standard of living of poor nations while we continue to hog most of the world's natural resources? It just doesn't work. The math doesn't work. There's a finite amount of all natural resources. So we have to strictly limit the populations of poor countries so we can continue to access their natural resources. So it's all about money. It's all about greed. The second motivation is famine in the USA and Europe. This used to be a big thing, and it's still a compelling secondary motivation of population control. Very interesting look at the early history of the population control movement. Malthusianism was coined, after Thomas Malthus, who wrote an essay on the principle of population back in 1798. In a later edition, he wrote, the power of population is indefinitely greater than the power of the earth to produce subsistence for man, but population, when unchecked, increases geometrically. Subsistence increases only arithmetically. This implies a strong and constantly operating check on population from the difficulty of subsistence. What this means is food production is linear. It only goes up by a certain percentage each year, while population is geometric, where it rises very quickly. And at the point where they cross, then there's crisis and people are going to start to starve. But what Malthus could not have known about back in those days is advanced agricultural techniques. And so now we are producing much more food, which is outpacing the population. According to the World Food Program of the United Nations, we could feed 50 billion people at a level of the United States or Europe. The problem of starvation is caused by corruption primarily and lack of transportation facilities, poor agricultural practices, and not enough grain storage facilities, so that up to 80 to 90% of the grain is consumed by rodents and insects. The Marquis de Sade, believe it or not, was the first person to advocate the legalization of abortion in modern times. He says, the state will forever be poor if its population surpasses the means by which it can subsist. Do you not prune the tree when it has too many branches? It's not at the moment when man reaches maturity we must destroy him in order to reduce population. It's unjust to cut short the days of a fully formed person. It's not unjust, I say, to prevent the arrival in the world of a being who will certainly be useless to it. The penalty against child murdering mothers or aborting mothers is an unexampled atrocity. Who has a greater right to dispose of the fruit than she who carries it in her womb? To interfere with the usage a woman chooses to make of it is stupidity carried beyond any conceivable extreme. You all here familiar with the Marquis de Sade? He liked to write novels about the torture and murder of pregnant women. The guy was a real sicko, and he was the first to advocate for the legalization of abortion in Europe, back in the same year that Thomas Malthus wrote an essay on principle of population in 1798. Back in 1928, the Birth Control Review was also big on this particular theme. You got the world there with modern problems, punching the stork in the nose, and the caption reads, "Hey you, can't you realize we need quality, not quantity?" Then we have the 1920 Birth Control Review. Within the next few months, millions of human beings, mostly Europeans, will starve to death. Food is lacking, and we can't avoid the Great Crash, which will, as its chief incident, cost uncounted millions of lives and bring in the train of that disaster nobody knows what governmental and social changes. Now we have Paul Ehrlich, the Frightmeister, population control Frightmeister. In 1968, he wrote his very famous book called The Population Bomb, which is still very, very well received by people who don't know any better. And right in there he says, the battle to feed humanity is lost. We'll not be able to prevent large-scale famines in the next decade. 65 million Americans will die of hunger by 1985. The U.S. population will decline to 22.6 million by 1999. The population is actually now 320 million, or 15 times larger. And the problem is not that we don't have enough food. If you look at the magazines that you see in the supermarket checkout counter, the problem is so many people are overweight. This guy was so far off the mark in almost every one of his predictions, yet he still held as credible by the population-controlled people. Then, of course, we have the movies, Charlton Heston in Soylent Green. Anybody seen this movie? It is really wild. I'd highly recommend it. It's really, really wild. I can't believe Charlton Heston lowered himself. It's Mystery Science Theater 3000 type of material, that kind of stuff there. Then we have the Zero Population Growth movie, also released in that same year of 1974. Smog covers the earth, the oxygen is depleted, love is encouraged, but the penalty for birth is death. The time is tomorrow and there's no time left. So everybody just about had this pants scared off them back in the 1970s about overpopulation. Those of you who are here this morning saw the famous Planned Parenthood population square, which says, if present birth rates continue, there'll be one human being standing on every square foot of land on earth. Here's a square foot, try it, stand on it, then take a stand for Planned Parenthood. Now, if you do the math on this, this means that there will be 23.9 trillion people on Earth by the year 2600. That's one person for every square foot, 250,000 people for every single one we have now. The reality is quite the opposite. In 1950, the average number of children had by every woman was about 5. That started to plunge like a rock, and now we're at about 2.5. And within just a few years, we're going to be under replacement, and the world's population will start to actually decline in the year 2040. It's already crashing in Europe. They're losing 2 million people every single year, despite the fact they have a lot of immigration from the south. The scientists examining the population bomb, saying it appears to have landed, but it didn't explode. The population of the entire world could comfortably fit in the state of Texas. Although if you've ever been to Texas, I wouldn't recommend living there. Or Chile, 1,156 feet a square foot per person. Or even France, for the entire rest of the world being completely empty. That's how empty the world is. A lot of these population controllers, like our science czar, has been to great big cities like Lagos, Nigeria, and Manila in the Philippines. And he says, oh my God, look at all these people. The whole world is overpopulated. Why doesn't he go out in the country, which is virtually empty? The problem in the third world is overconcentration of people in the cities because of things like NSSM 200, which is driving them off their land because these big multinational corporations are getting rid of them. They're pushing the people off their land because they've always lived there. They don't have legal titles for land. It's especially a big problem in places like Nigeria and the Philippines. Environmentalism is the next big push to lower the population. These people truly do care about the earth, but unfortunately, perhaps they care about it a little too much. Mass extinction, bushfires, and severe drought over the next 100 years, and sometimes the propaganda they put out is absolutely amazing. I've got to go back to that one. You have to see this in the movie here. I'm just going to have to play it without it being embedded, I guess. melting icebergs, depressed polar bears.
Those monkeys.
Suicidal.
If you give up, they give up. Stop global warming. I don't know whether to laugh or cry or whatever when I see that kind of stuff. It's really kind of silly. As we saw this morning, I remember, perhaps some of you do too, that if you denied global cooling back in the early 1970s, you were a freak. The central fact is the Earth's climate is cooling down. Meteorologists are almost unanimous in the view that the trend will reduce agricultural productivity. They actually had something called global cooling deniers back then, who could lose their jobs if they denied that the Earth was cooling down. 17 years later, everything flip-flopped. The atmosphere may be reaching the limit of its capacity to absorb emitted carbon dioxide without falling into a disastrous greenhouse effect. So this is what the Caribbean was supposed to look like in about 50 years, in just a few years from now. In the year 2025, the entire Northern American continent is going to be one big ice cube. So if you're going to have your honeymoon in, say, St. Lucia or Trinidad and Tobago, make sure to take your snowsuit and your skis with you. A major cooling of the planet is widely considered inevitable, said the New York Times. The Times of London said the cooling trend could result in the return to another ice age. Science News said we're going to have a full-blown 10,000-year ice age involving extensive northern hemisphere glaciation, which means everything north of Charleston, South Carolina would be a glacier. A new ice age must now stand along nuclear war as a likely source of wholesale death and misery. Everybody was unanimous that the world was cooling down and cooling down fast. So what really is going to happen? Is the Earth going to burn up, or is it going to be totally frozen? Nobody really knows. That's the problem. The science is conflicting. But there's no doubt that our world is warming up. Since 1880 to 2000, about 120 years, we've gained about 1.1 degrees Fahrenheit, about 0.7 degrees centigrade, which is quite significant. But that's where they stopped telling you the truth. This is true, but they don't tell you about the long-term record, which has been found by scientists by drilling under the ice caps of Antarctica and the Arctic. We have a natural cycle over about 1,000 years each where it gets warm, then it cools off, gets warm and cools off, and so on, mainly due to volcanoes, not CO2 emissions. Otherwise, we believe that when the Hebrews were exodus from Europe, Egypt, under the Pharaoh, they were all driving a bunch of great big gas-guzzling SUVs, and that's why in 1100 BC it was very warm, much warmer than it is now. So all they tend to tell you about is this little bit here, the yellow rectangle here. Already it appears from the drilling in the ice caps that the increase in temperature is starting to slow down, and most likely within 20 years will peak and then will start to drop again. And once again, probably in about 30 or 40 years, everybody's going to be talking about how we're not going to be able to grow vegetables anymore because everything's so frozen. Here's some more propaganda. This was actually shown on public television in Britain. It's called the 10-10 program.
Right, so just before you go, there's a brilliant idea here that I'd like to provide. Now it's called 10-10. The idea is everyone start cutting their carbon emissions by
Everybody hear that?
Too loud.
And the planet stay forever eventually. Now this hasn't got to be a huge thing, but I would love it if you and your families would think about doing something.
What sort of thing, Liz?
Well, like getting your dad to insulate the loft, or taking your next holiday by train instead of flying, or buying energy-saving light bulbs. We're thinking of using our car less. I'm going to cycle to school. That's fantastic, Jemima. Now, no pressure at all, but it'd be great to get a sense of how many of you might do this. Just a rough percentage. That's fantastic! And there's Nora. Philip and Tracy. That's fine, that's absolutely fine. It's your own choice. Okay, class, thank you so much for today, and I will see you all tomorrow. Oh, just before you go, I just need to press this little button here. Now, everybody, please remember to read chapters 5 and 6 on volcanoes and glaciation, except Philip and Tracy, of course.
Right, just want to check.
So was Spencer and Tracy, they got blown up. So the message is pretty clear, follow what we tell you to do or you're going to be killed. That was pulled even off of the UK television after about 2 or 3 days. There are 3 or 4 of those commercials. I have them all here. One has, the businessmen getting blown up, and another one has the football players being killed. But this is the kind of propaganda they have to put up with in Great Britain. The conclusion is nobody really knows what's going to happen regarding long-term global temperature trends, and if they say they do, they're simply delusional. Why is this important? Because the mass sterilization camps that are going on right now in India, rounding up women and forcing them to be sterilized regardless of their age, are being done in the name of global warming. DFID, which is the Department for International Development, USAID in the United States, DFID's from Great Britain, the Gates Foundation are all knowingly funding these programs to sterilize as many women as they possibly can under quotas in India for the sake of preserving the environment and stopping CO2 emissions. They wouldn't dare try that in the United States, but rounding up the poor Indian women. One doctor did 49 sterilizations in 2 hours without running water, without electricity. He did the operations by flashlight. He didn't even sterilize his instruments between doing the sterilizations. A lot of his women died, but he got an award for being efficient. Self-hatred is another really sad motivation behind population control. You really can't believe the kind of websites that are out there. You can buy bumper stickers that say humans are a pestilence, worst species ever, and even little onesies for your babies. Humans are a pestilence, coming in lovely robin's egg blue and pink for a boy and a girl. Now what kind of a moron will put this on their own child? If you think that the humans are a pestilence, then of course you're going to want to hold down our number. There's a very large number of people out there who believe that we are some kind of invasive species that should be exterminated. You ever hear of the voluntary human extinction movement, which says that every human being should eventually die out and leave the earth to its natural condition? You see this doctor looking down at here, I guess it's Saturn, telling the earth, I'm afraid you have humans. So there's the idea of humans being an infection on the earth. Here's another movie I think you'll enjoy. If I can get the stupid thing to work. There's some hang up on this, but I can still show it. The Stork. Isn't that something? Mercy. Must have really worked themselves into a sweat when they were making that thing. The next, and one of the underlying motivations of population control has always been racism. If you look at the history, this is the masthead of the Birth Control League out of the United Kingdom, founded by Marie Stopes. And it's now Marie Stopes International, which is admitted to doing illegal abortions all over Africa. It says, joyous and deliberate motherhood, birth control, a sure light in our racial darkness. That was code words back in the 1920s or 1930s for people with dark skin, or non-whites. The Birth Control Review, Margaret Sanger's publication for the American Birth Control League, which is now, of course, Planned Parenthood, birth control to create a race of thoroughbreds. Blonde-haired, blue-eyed, muscular, very healthy Aryan-type thoroughbreds. What are the population controllers afraid of? Let's take a look at what Lothrop Stoddard said. This is a Yale professor who said in his book, The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy, that none of the colored races shows perceptible signs of declining birth rate. They all tend to breed up to the limits of available subsistence. This can only mean a tremendous and steadily augmenting outward thrust of surplus colored men from overcrowded colored homelands. Crossings with a Negro are always fatal. Whites, Amerindians, or Asiatics are all wiped out by the invincible prepotency of the more primitive, generalized, and lower Negro blood. In ethnic crossings, a Negro strikingly displays its prepotency for black blood. Once it enters a human stock, is never really bred out again. So he saw black people as less than human. I have the originals of his book. You can see The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy shows Asians. The African, of course, is depicted as a spear-chucking savage, and the Asians are all savage and everything with their knives and swords. And the menace of the underman, the revolt against civilization, is even worse. You got black people depicted as ugly, hairy apes throwing Molotov cocktails. And of course, you're going to have the Jewish guy behind there, because the Jews, as he believed, were behind all of the world's problems. Now, why do I bring up this guy? Because he was Margaret Sanger's most trusted advisor and sat on the board of the American Birth Control League for more than 10 years. Margaret Sanger got her ideas from Lothrop Stoddard. Planned Parenthood still gets their ideas from Margaret Sanger. The demographic cross is what they're frightened of. Back in 1950s, Africa was virtually empty, with only 9% of the world's population. Europe was relatively crowded with 22%, but then they started to abort and contracept and neutralize themselves out of existence. They started to lose population while Africa continued to grow. They crossed over with identical populations for the first time in 1997. And by the year 2050, Africa will have 21% of the world's population. Europe will have 8%. So where does the future of the world lie? A small continent without many natural resources, average age of 60 by the year 2050, or a very large continent with most of the world's natural resources, average age of 29, and a large population of almost 2 billion people. The future of the world belongs to Africa, and that's what these racist population controllers are afraid of. They don't want the world to be run by black people. Our current day abortionists are extremely racist. Abortionist Edward Allred, who has a $60 million fortune from doing third trimester abortions, says, I do free abortions in Mexico to stem the new influx of Hispanic immigrants. Their lack of respect for social order is frightening. When a sullen black woman of 17 or 18 can decide to have a baby and get welfare and food stamps, they become a burden on all of us. It's time to stop. In parts of South LA, having babies for welfare is the only industry these people have. He's still very popular among the pro-abortionists as a speaker. Heck, if some conservative had said this, they would have crucified him. But really, you have to follow the money to see how racist the population control program really is. Look at where it's spent in the world. No population control dollars are spent in the United States or Canada because we're white countries. $9.60 per person has been spent in the last 20 years only in Eastern Europe to help hold down the population of the lower class Eastern European people. Almost $6 per person there in South America, $6 or so in the Middle East, $11.87 per person in Central America. Here's where it gets interesting. $15 almost all against the Aboriginal people of New Zealand and Australia, $31 per person in Africa, $40 per person among the black populations of the Caribbean. That's where the emphasis is. Now why are they spending all that money on Africa and the Caribbean if Asia is the most crowded place with 63% of the world's population, only $3 per person there? Why the tremendous emphasis on Africa and the Caribbean? One, racism. Two, we want to get our hands on the natural resources of Africa. It's the only possible explanation. The grand strategy, infiltrate the power structures, find a stable source of income, in other words, get the governments to fund the abortion programs so the countries are paying to cut their own throats, generate frightening propaganda, promote worldwide abortion by eliminating unsafe abortion, stereotype and neutralize the opposition. Now if you look at the power structures, the most efficient way is not to replace the power structures with your own, but it's been understood for thousands of years that you infiltrate them and then turn them to your own purposes. Sun Tzu said all warfare is based primarily on deceiving an enemy. Fighting on a battlefield is the most primitive way of making war. There's no art higher than to destroy your enemy without a fight by subverting anything of value in your enemy's country. In Africa especially, they're very close to God and family, so the idea here is to make God irrelevant and to say you can do what you want. You don't have to, be faithful to your wife. You kids, you don't have to be chaste until marriage. You can start having sex. We'll give you the condoms you need to do the job. The 10 sources of influence in the world are classified into 3 different categories. The collective or focused sources of influence are these 8 here, where only about 0.5% of the people direct the rest of the world and manufacture and produce the symbols that represent what their values are, especially the United Nations, a $55 billion a year behemoth which is changing things all over the world, and the non-governmental organization certified by the UN. Then in each country you have the executive branch, the courts, the legislatures of the provinces or states, the professional associations, especially medical and legal, the media, and the school leadership. If you can get into those and start to turn them to your way of thinking, then you've won the fight. In Africa, this is the standard operating procedure, SOP. Billions of dollars is being used every year to corrupt these organizations. Once you've done that, then you press down on the church and the family. You try to make them irrelevant. You say we have to have separation of church and state. The church has no place telling the state where to go, but meanwhile the state can tell the church what to do anything. This last election of a Pope Francis, the United States government had some high people saying, we ought to force the Vatican to allow us to have observers in the conclave inside the Sistine Chapel so we can make sure that it's a fair election and that we have a Pope for the people. Believe it or not, they're starting to talk about forcing the Vatican to allow monitors in while they elect a Pope. So this idea of separation of church and state always goes just one way. The state can tell the church what to do, but certainly not vice versa. Generate income from governments and product sales. The family planning industry in the United States is immensely rich. A lot of people gripe about the nearly $1 billion they make off abortions every year, but that's just a tiny part of it. Sterilizations, 1.2 million, brings in nearly $3 billion. Contraception, nearly $10 billion. Sex education, $650 million. We're talking $13.6 billion in 2010. Well, the pro-life groups, what do we have against that? The total income of all pro-life groups is about $250 million. So they outspend us at least 50 to 1. The population control funding by the so-called developed world has gone up tremendously under Bush and Obama. It used to be about $2 billion a year. It's gone up to $9 billion, and it's now climbing up towards the $15 billion mark. In the last 15 or 16 years, we've spent $98 billion on making large poor families into small poor families. So what could you do for $98 billion? You could turn the countries of Haiti and Mali in Africa into first world countries. Clean drinking water, electricity, paved roads, modern schools, basic health care, modern farming equipment and grain storage facilities. $98 billion. And we could have turned the basket cases of Mali and Haiti into first world countries. But instead, they're still just as poor as they were before. What a waste of money. The biggest donor, of course, is the United States, $46 billion. The UK with 10, and on from there. Notice these are all very rich countries who have to have the natural resources of the poor countries. So we have to hold their populations down so they don't use their own natural resources, so we can get our greedy hands on them. How the money flows from developed world governments to the big population control NGOs. We have to go through them. Medicine Sans Frontiers, Doctors Without Borders, operates illegal abortion clinics all over the world. Marie Stopes International, DKT International, Family Health International, International Planned Parenthood Federation. We can't go into a country in Africa and say, okay, people, start holding your population down. They're going to think we're racist. What we do is we hire local people from Mali or Nigeria, Malawi, wherever you want, pay them big salaries and have them represent the population control. It's very, very effective. Down to the developing world governments. That's how the money flows. The key to beating them is cutting their funding. Even though we've shown the Bush administration and the Obama administration through formal submissions that this population control money is going to support the Chinese forced abortion program, the forced sterilization camps in India, and many other countries of the world, they don't care. You know, Bush and all those people didn't care, neither does Obama. Promote worldwide abortion by eliminating unsafe abortion. NSSM 200, back in 1974, says no country has reduced its population growth without resorting to abortion. Malcolm Potts of IPPF, who knows more about the topic than anybody else in the world, says, no developed country has brought down its birth rate without considerable recourse to abortion. It's unlikely the developing countries can ever hope to see a decline in their fertility without a massive resort to induced abortion, legal or illegal. So we have to hold down those populations. Remember what the health of the mother exception says? This is how these sneaky people work in other countries. They say, we don't want abortion on demand. We just want to legalize abortion to save the life and the health of the mother. And everybody thinks that sounds very, very popular. But that sounds acceptable, right? But under the Supreme Court of the United States, a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. It includes its physical, emotional, psychological, familial, and the woman's age. In other words, if you have a health exception for abortion, that's abortion on demand. So next time you see pro-lifers fighting a health exception, don't think they're heartless. Look a little bit further into the topic and you'll find they're fighting abortion on demand. The United Nations aped the Supreme Court decision by saying the health of the mother is complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity in all matters relating to the reproductive system and its functions and processes. The United Nations is the largest promoter of abortion all over the world today. And we have people like this judge up in Pennsylvania who said that poverty is a medical condition. So this is the kind of thinking we're dealing with here. These people are very dishonest, and they'll take any possible exception to mean that abortion on demand. The big guns, International Planned Parenthood Federation, The United Nations Population Fund, which designed and operates the Chinese forced abortion program. Marie Stopes International. I was just in Tororo, Uganda a year and a half ago. They have a Marie Stopes International clinic there where abortions are illegal. But they do abortions anyway, they don't care. And when women go in there for malaria shots, they instead give them Depo-Provera shots that will keep them infertile for 6 to 9 months. So they tell these women they're getting a malaria treatment and instead shooting them up with contraception, abortifacient type contraception. So they treat these women like animals, not telling them what's going on, directly lying to them, completely ignoring the laws of the sovereign country. And then they're the ones who turn around and say that we have to respect diversity. Center for Reproductive Rights, International Medical Corps, the Population Council, Pathfinder International, all 100 million plus organizations, $100 million a year plus income. United Nations pro-abortionism. Legislation should provide for immediate access to comprehensive and integrated services, including pregnancy testing, emergency contraception, abortion services, treatment for STDs at the expense of the state, withholding legal abortion as a form of gender-based discrimination and violence against women. So pro-life laws are violence against women. And just last week they came out with another document that said that you're torturing women if you don't give them abortion. This is how screwed up, bizarre, and twisted these people think. That withholding abortion for women is the same as, flogging of a pillar or something like that. It's just ridiculous. Paragraph 820 of the Program of Action of the ICPD, our objectives are to promote women's health and safe motherhood, to reduce greatly the number of deaths and morbidity from unsafe abortion. Remember, to them, any abortion that's illegal is unsafe, and any abortion that's legal is safe. They're synonymous terms. So what they're doing here is they're saying reduce greatly the number of deaths and morbidity from illegal abortion by making it illegal. What happens then? The same people who are doing the abortions before are doing them after. The number of abortions greatly decrease, and the number of women who die increases also. Every country I've ever gone to, they lie about the number of women who die of illegal abortion. 600,000 die, they say, in Russia every year, when the actual number is 1,800. Same for India. They said 400,000 die every year of illegal abortions in Brazil. The actual number is a maximum of 241. Nigeria and Mexico, you can see all these numbers. Everywhere you go, they lie. Remember, they don't see anything wrong with lying. United States, some wild-eyed feminists said that 200,000 women died every year before Roe v. Wade. The actual number was 40. And they still say, some of them, that 1 million women die every year of illegal abortions. Some say 140,000, some say 70,000. They can't even get their act together enough to do something wrong right. But if 70,000 women die annually of illegal abortions around the world, how can 600,000 die in Russia? All you have to do is look at their conflicting numbers. The inevitable outcome of evil policies is coercion. As Nietzsche said, liberal institutions immediately cease being liberal the moment they're soundly established. Once this is attained, no more grievous and more thorough enemies of freedom exist in liberal institutions. And this guy was an atheist philosopher, so he knew the score a century ago. Here's John Holdren, the science czar, who wrote in a book with the Ehrlichs that we need in the United States forced abortions of any unmarried woman, a worldwide two-child policy. We need to put sterilizing drugs in the water supplies of the United States so people stop having babies. Children should be seized and adopted out from single mothers. Undesirables like black people and welfare recipients should be forcibly sterilized. And we have to have a planetary regime with a huge police organization to enforce population policy. This is the guy who's working for the Obama administration. And this was all laid out in his book, Eco-Science, Population, Resources, Environment, which he wrote with the famous Paul and Ann Ehrlich. Remember, those are the ones who said that most Americans are going to die of starvation. So this guy has a very powerful station in Obama's White House now as a science czar, and he heavily influences our population control programs. There are more than 20 major agencies in the United Nations. Every single one of them pushes abortion and population control all around the world. They say United Nations is your world, more likely it's our world, because they have more and more control with every passing year. A lot of pro-abortion people have actually approved of the Chinese forced abortion program. Molly Yard said, "I consider their population control policy among the most intelligent in the world. It's a policy limited to the heavily overpopulated areas. It's an attempt to feed the people of China. I find it very intelligent." They've had forced abortion, sterilization, and contraception for more than 30 years now, and this lady finds that to be a good program. Well, this is the kind of thinking that predominates among the pro-choice people, the population controllers especially. Nafis Sadiq, who is a former executive director of the UN Population Fund, China has every reason to feel proud of its remarkable family planning policy. Now the country can offer its experiences and special experts to help other countries to put in place forced abortion programs. Now that's kind of frightening. It should be frightening even to a very liberal person. The problem is, according to the eyes of the people who see it that way, is as we go along, the poor nations will have more and more of the population of the world. Developed nations will have less and less. So we have to hold down this population as much as we possibly can, and also keep them right where they are. Remember what Ravenholz said. I quoted him about 30 minutes ago. We have to stop these third world nations right where they are. So we've got to keep them small and poor so we can get our hands on their natural resources. The world population in billions is increasing. It'll hit somewhere between 7.5 and 8.1 billion in the year 2040, where it's now about 7.2 billion, and then the population will start to drop rapidly, according to the United Nations Population Information Network. This shows it graphically. If you look at the arrow on the bottom, at the total fertility rate average among all women in the world, back in the 1950s, the average family size was 5. Hard to believe. Heavily influenced by Asia and Africa. You can see that there's a lot of kids being had in the southern hemisphere and not very many children being had in the northern hemisphere. Then as time goes on, it all starts to go downhill. Whereas we currently have close to replacement worldwide, within 10 years we'll go below replacement. By 2050, almost no countries will be replacing their population, and by 2100, about 88 years, 87 years, no countries will be replacing their population. This is the desired outcome. So that's the end of that presentation. I thank you for your attention. Anybody got any comments or questions? We finished right on time. Careful, I can turn on the lights here. Shield your eyes if you have to. Comments or questions? Yes, sir.
There was a section there where you were giving figures on the number of dollars spent per person on, I don't know if it was population control or abortion or whatever. It was like 0 in America.
Yeah.
So who is spending those dollars? Is that America?
Who's spending them? Yeah, let's see. Where the heck was that? Was it in the beginning?
It was a little past halfway, I'd say.
Yeah, here's the, if you look at the DVD, it has highly detailed information. Yeah, here are the biggest population control donors over the last 16 years. By far, the UK and the United States, probably 2/3 of what's being put towards population control. On this little DVD, there's a highly detailed spreadsheet that shows every country, 60 countries donating population control, and exactly which countries it goes to.
So those figures, like $31 per person in Africa, that was spent by all countries in the world?
Yeah, that's the average amount of money spent on each person.
Because if you consider like the amount of money that we taxpayers are paying to
Planned Parenthood right now, which is 360 million or whatever a year, I mean, that's kind of going to decrease the population too. So that is.
Well, the United
indirect
States, that all
effect.
goes towards decreasing our population.
Right, exactly. So there
Yeah.
is some money kind of being spent even to decrease our population.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To promote, to have these big programs promoting abortion, contraception all around.
And then one thing that you were talking about was in Central America. You were saying that in like Haiti, it was it $40 around there or something? It was
Yeah,
pretty
the
high.
Caribbean, about $40 per person.
$40 per person. And if the argument is that it's because we want their resources, what resources do we want there? Or is it really there more racism?
Yeah, really, they don't have all that many resources, especially in places like Haiti. Hispaniola down there, they don't have many resources. The primary target is Africa.
Africa for the resources.
But since the Caribbean is 80% black, you might as well throw a whole bunch of money over there too.
So is that mostly United Nations organizations that are doing that, or?
This is the money that's donated to all population control organizations, including the United Nations, especially the United Nations Population Fund. So this represents all the money donated by the United States during 16 years to all of the population control organizations. I have tens of thousands of IRS Forms 990 on my hard drive back at work. And this is the result of adding all of them up, where the taxpayer money comes from, where it goes. It's just never ending. This is probably not even all of it.
So this is taxpayer money. Those countries, the taxpayers paying that. That's not like the foundation that's paying this.
No, this is all taxpayer money.
Okay, so if you add in the, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation money
Yeah,
spent.
well, that would be impossible to figure out. If you add them in, you could easily double this. So all those numbers should be at least double because they have these giant population control foundations that are contributing to all this too.
So how much money totally is spent worldwide to, like, by pro-choicers versus how much money pro-lifers have?
Well, if you look at the total amount of money spent on population control and pushing abortion, it's over $20 billion a year. And if you add up all the pro-life groups outside this country, it's probably $5 million a year. So it's about a ratio of $4,000 to 1. So it amuses me when in other countries these people are beating their breasts and saying these big American pro-life organizations, anti-choice organizations are so well-funded and all the rest of us. They just have to laugh at it, 'Cause once again, they're lying right through their teeth. Yes.
The information you gave about the science czar is disgusting.
Well, the actual page images
Is this
are on this
man
DVD.
not guilty of treason against our country?
Do you think Obama cares? He says, I have a goal and I don't care who the hell I hire. That guy would hire Hitler if his objective was to wipe out the Jews, He'd hire anybody. And, on this DVD, if you look in the beginning document for Holdren, spell out his name and search for it, it has the actual page images out of his book highlighted, showing exactly what I was showing you just there.
What's the best way to use that DVD? Just as a reference for information and data?
Yeah,
Or is
yeah.
there a program of study on there or something?
There is a program of study on here. It's a pro-life training program is also on here, which is 12 hours, the basics of the activism, how to plan, what our mission is, how the other side thinks, how they operate, how to debate, how to organize a pro-life or pro-family group. And then there's the facts of life, which has all of, if you ever have to look up some kind of information on population control, euthanasia, whatever, homosexuality, it's all in there.
By the time you go through the 12-hour program, do you know a lot of this data and information, or?
Oh yeah, you know a lot of it. All the PowerPoint presentations are also on here. So once you get done with the 12 hours, you got about 3 years of equivalent experience of pro-lifing under your belt there. That's about how much the average pro-lifer knows without direction over 3 or 5 years.
Brian,
Yes.
you know, we talk about defunding Planned Parenthood. Is there any way to defund the UN?
Not politically, not as far as I know. They're getting bigger by about $5 to $8 million every year. This incredibly large bureaucracy is just totally out of control. And these people do some pretty bad things. When my wife and I were in Cambodia, we did an investigation there. Why did the AIDS epidemic suddenly take off so quickly after they managed to hold it down? Well, the guy who ran the UN operations there said, yeah, we know a lot of our UN troops have AIDS, but it's their right to have sex without a condom if they want. So the UN actually started the AIDS epidemic in Cambodia. They're worse than useless.
Are the UN troops mercenaries? Aren't they from different countries?
They are from different countries, yes. It's kind of like each country has a quota they have to provide to the United Nations, including the United States. So they all train together as units, hopefully speaking the same language or wear the UN uniform and so on.
Why would they have so much AIDS? I mean, those are soldiers, right?
Yeah. Well, I imagine that the contingent that went to Cambodia was primarily African soldiers. And they have up to a 25% adult HIV infection rate for many of those countries, like South Africa. Lesotho, it's 37%. Swaziland, it's 33%, 1 out of 3 adults with full-blown HIV/AIDS. There's incredibly large numbers.
Is AIDS still fatal?
In Africa it is. The ARVs, the antiretrovirals, are not really available too much there. So from the time you're diagnosed to the time you die is about 3 years on the average.
So who is this man that you said that we should look into, that's the population control movement agenda, is the colonization of the mind? You said he was really good.
Himoto Kane, yeah.
Himoto King?
Himodoukane. He's from Senegal.
And he is pro-life, basically.
I don't think so. I think he's just a philosopher and novelist. But he definitely opposes the population control agenda. I don't think he's ever given us his view on that. He's just decrying the tremendous corruption of African values by Western values.
Do you have the Alinsky book on your?
The most important parts, yeah. Just excerpts because it's copyrighted. So I have the amount you can take out of it without violating the copyright laws. The good stuff is in chapter 5 on tactics with 13 rules for radicals. And that's where a lot of my training comes from. Now that he took down the establishment, now the anti-life people at the establishment, we can use the same tactics against them. Very effectively too.
Who is he involved with?
He founded something called the Industrial Areas Foundation, which, despite its plain vanilla name, was the very first large-scale community organizing type of group.
Could you repeat that? It was the industrial what?
Industrial Areas Foundation, IAF. Obama learned a lot from him.
Brian, you're giving us a lot of bad news. How are we gonna stop this thing?
Don't worry, we win in the end. Demographics. Well, you go through the pro-life training program first, and the way to do this is to train, recruit, learn information, and pray. That's the Christian's way of looking at it. well, with the Atheist and Agnostic Pro-Life League is just trained, recruited information. So what you do is you learn the topic and then you start to recruit people into the pro-life movement, one-on-one. All you need to do is bring one person in every year. If we all did that, the pro-life movement will be twice as powerful next March, and 4 times as powerful in March of 2015. So learn the topic and start to bring people in. Everybody knows 2 or 3 folks who are inclined to be pro-life but who aren't because they have 1 or 2 misunderstandings about the pro-life movement. You know, we have too many people, or what about abortion for rape or incest, or pro-lifers are violent, all this kind of stuff. If you can learn the topic and then talk them past those objections, and then get them involved and keep them gainfully employed in the pro-life movement, it'll go a long way towards winning this thing. It's a one-on-one type deal, I'm afraid. A lot of really difficult, grinding, difficult work, but we got to do it if we're going to win. The opposition did it, now we got to do it.
Do you know anything about in Guatemala, what the percentage of money is that they spend on population control?
Guatemala. Yeah, it's all in the DVD. Every country in the world where population control is spent is on there, but I sure don't know it off the top of my head.
So just know Jorge's from Guatemala. So.
Oh. Wow. Well, welcome. Look around you at all these white people here. We're an endangered species, so be nice to us. There are less white people every year because we're too damn selfish to have children anymore. And if we die out, which we probably will in 700 or 800 years, we deserve to die out. So you're welcome to the world. Sorry we screwed it up so bad. Yes,
How
ma'am.
much are those DVDs?
How much are they? Well, we usually sell them for $25, but if you can't afford it, anything less, donation to HLI would be good.
What about your point that you were making with the pandas, the bonobos, the elephants, all these animals that were going extinct, and then you said that, look at that, was it because we were able to bring them back because we had some of their DNA, or?
No, the idea is that everybody recognizes them as being, you know, pandas or bonobos or whatever they are from the moment of when the sperm and the egg unite, they're protected. Okay, anything you do to hurt a pregnant animal can put you in jail. But anything you do to hurt a pregnant human, you can make a lot of money.